one of the reasons why my mother's workplace and the need for her to be close to her workplace was so important for us at that point in time was one of the reasons was questions of safety. You know, this idea that she would have to travel from Delhi all the way to Gurgaon and then come back all the way to Delhi. I sort of vaguely remember it being part of the conversations. Our family moved to Gurgaon from Delhi in the early 2000s. So it was just around the turn of the beginning of the millennium in which the Millennium City kind of was supposed to have sprawled out in front of us. And for the first decade of that, till the early 2010s, I remember going to school in Delhi, going to relatives in Delhi, meeting friends in Delhi. So Gurgaon was very much a space where we were almost forced to move from Delhi. And there was very little infrastructurally, very little, certainly none of what we associate with Gurgaon now, the sort of high-tech, consumptive, capitalistic space was almost in a kind of rudimentary stage. Things were coming up, it was never quite that. And I'm talking about the late 2000s, early 2010s. So that was very interesting. Because I remember asking my parents, why are we moving to Gurgaon? And obviously they had no reason except the fact that we were moving closer to their workplace, which was 10 minutes away from home. But in terms of the city, there was very little about it that I thought was a millennium city. Or it was almost like the millennium is about to come, even though there were hoardings that I clearly remember from our house saying Millennium City, Gurgaon. So there was that intriguing thing which I still remember as a child. The second thing that I remember at that time was we used to live very close to the highway, literally where the cyber city metro stations have now developed. And one of the almost the seasonal things that I remember were the Kavadiya Yatras that used to keep happening. And I remember this because I remember my mother once had a bit of a skirmish with one of the local administrators because the Kavadiyas who used to walk with the pots of Ganga Jal on their shoulders from Haridwar through Gurgaon going back to their villages would all stay in these rest houses which were along the highway. One of them was very near our house. And I remember they used to, apart from the chanting of the slogans of Jai Shri Ram and all that, the moment the slogans would die down, they would all come and do defecation in the neighborhood. And the neighborhood consisted of one house, which was us. And while we didn't have much of a problem with it, but it was also a bit curious, that this was happening. And I distinctly remember once that there was I think it must have been a Muharram procession or something that was moving from the road and the authorities had somehow clamped down on it. And I was very young, so I didn't really, I must have been in my early teens. So I was also, just sort of figuring these things out. These were all men, by the way. There were no women in these public spaces. And I remember my mother once asking one of these administrators about, either not allowing anybody to use those areas around our house or creating facilities for them elsewhere. The reason I bring this up is because I feel like one of the things that has really changed about Gurgaon over the years is the communalization of the space in a very outward way. Now, I'd like to think of that not as something exceptional to this particular moment, although there are factors. I'd like to think of it in a broader history. And I'd like to think of my sort of childhood in Gurgaon as throwing up these moments where religion, men occupying public space in particular ways, at a time when Gurgaon was a kind of incipient millennium city, as being part of that longer history of Gurgaon's development. The seduction of Gurgaon as a millennium city has always been its ability to project itself as a kind of work in progress, which is never complete. I mean, the hoardings may have gone down, but in one's interactions with people, with men and women, this idea of the Millennium City, almost this kind of watermark, hologram of the Millennium City still lingers. And it doesn't just linger, it's present in people's minds. I think for me, the contradiction of Gurgaon is that even though we might describe it as a satellite town of Delhi, where developers from Delhi came to construct the city, or, but we must never forget that it's also very much part of the broader geography of Haryana. And that contradiction of where Gurgaon fits and how and for whom is, I think, where this contradiction of the Millennium City comes up. Because for those of us, including me and my family, who I grew up in Delhi and then moved to Gurgaon, Gurgaon was always a kind of satellite to Delhi. It would always have that kind of second order feeling, both in terms of inhabiting it, but also in terms of the people I talked to perceiving Gurgaon. But for those who come to Gurgaon from Jhajjar, from Sirsa, from other parts of Haryana, or even indeed from Punjab or Himachal, for them the Millennium City and its resonance presents, I think, a totally different set of aspirations and ambitions. How do they collide and how do they come to be braided together is, I think, where the tensions and intrigue of Gurgaon really comes up. The question of safety is undoubtedly a complicated one. And I can tell you there have been various phases in my life when I have felt safer and not felt safer. So for instance, a couple of years ago, I had long hair. And negotiating Gurgaon as a man with long hair was almost nightmarish. I can get into why it was nightmarish, but outwardly, because I think it kind of flew in the face of, a sort of generalized sense of masculine embodiment, But in terms of safety generally, I would feel as safe or as unsafe in Gurgaon as I would feel in Delhi. Why that's the case? I'm thinking, and it's probably because, again, one is almost sort of taught to see Gurgaon in light of what Delhi is like. Delhi or NCR, which extends to Uttar Pradesh, Delhi, and Noida, Delhi, and Haryana, and Gurgaon become the kind of comparative unit. But I think that for me, as somebody growing up in Gurgaon, it's always been very fascinating to think of Gurgaon's place within Haryana. Because I'm pretty sure that a lot of people would think Gurgaon is a safe space, because in relation to other parts of Haryana, perhaps the kind of privileges that they can enjoy in public space, negotiating public transport might be different. But my experience of the city has been, as a man, it's been rough. As a queer person, it's been even rougher. So in my experience with Haryanvis in Gurgaon, I don't think they're able to place me because I'm not Haryanvi. I can't even, attempt to speak it. But with the Punjabis in Gurgaon, there's a similar kind of edging out, because even my Punjabi doesn't have that kind of lilt in that sense. So I think that part of the experience of the city and its safety is the way in which one performs gender or embodies a kind of masculine presence. And for anybody who's on the edges of that as a queer person or as as someone else, it becomes difficult. These questions of masculinity, particularly in the context of Gurgaon, are also tied inevitably to questions of caste, of class, of social affiliation and social identity. Now, if we say that, this kind of macho culture is sort of dominant in Gurgaon, my first question is, why is that? And in my observation, it could be possibly to do with also the social textures of Gurgaon. Even if we were to just look at the caste composition of the area, we're in a space which is dominated by the Yadavs, numerically, but a lot of them have been clamoring since the mid 2010s for backward class status, which is an irony because in other parts of India the Yadavs are including in Delhi and in Rajasthan, and I'm talking about the sort of satellite areas of Gurgaon, Yadavs are OBCs. But in Haryana, Yadavs are dominant caste. They are not OBC. So they've been clamoring for that. So in my interactions with men, whether these have been in public transport as auto drivers, as bus drivers, as cab drivers, whether these have been interactions in marketplaces, or indeed with men in, corporate spaces. I mean, I kind of think that masculinity creates a certain culture because of the social textures. And Gurgaon is a space where all of those things are colliding in very rapid ways, I think, because even its projection as a millennium city, I mean, I think there's a deeper history to it. This started in, the sort of late 90s, early 2000s, and definitely in my assessment, as I was mentioning with the Kavariyas, as I was mentioning with the other Muslim procession, the projection of Gurgaon as a millennium city for this millennium consumer, clearly a man, needs to be unpacked as well. Because let's also remember, I think, that throughout these decades, the 2000s, even the 2010s, Haryana has continued to have the ignominy, I should say, of having one of the worst sex ratios in the country. Till date, I think the sex ratio, Haryana as a state has one of the lowest sex ratios. So even this idea of the millennium city was clearly not the millennium city for everybody. It was a millennium city perhaps for an aspirational Jat man. It was a millennium city perhaps for an aspirational Gujar peasant man who has now made it to the city. I'm not even sure that, those of us who came from outside had much of a claim in this idea of the millennium city to begin with. I think the question of women in Gurgaon is particularly fascinating, especially if we were to look at Gurgaon again in relation to Haryana at large, because again, this whole idea of Beti Bachao, Beti Padhao, or this whole idea of the Ladli Yojana, which are very state-specific schemes directed towards improving the sex ratio. I mean, I'm not sure if they're doing anything else, because when I was a journalist covering parts of Gurgaon, the one thing that kept coming up when we would talk to state officials about Gurgaon, they would say that, yeah, sex ratio has increased because we've increased punitive raids on clinics where, prenatal sex determination tests have happened. But one's question was always, I mean, is this kind of punitive approach to improving gender imbalance ever going to really change things? And the moment one would talk to women, or the moment one would talk to women running, women's safety centers, the narrative would unravel. Because essentially what Beti Bachao, Beti Padhao, or these other, movements have done is, of course, directed attention towards gender in ways that it didn't exist before in Haryana. At least, there is a kind of lip service that everybody can pay. But at every level, one at the level of data, I mean, I remember speaking to somebody who said that it is a myth to think that Haryana's sex ratio has improved, because even the kind of data sources that you would use to calculate that, something called the civil registry and something called the, I'm forgetting the exact name, but basically two different data sources. And this was a demographer working in the State Department who said that it is a myth to think that the sex ratio has improved. So let's keep that aside. B, even if it's improved, it's due to punitive raids on clinics. So very little that's happening within, within the homes of people. And the third thing is that I think all the analyses of Gurgaon, I think, are also, sort of, whether it's the analysis of Beti Bachao or it's the analysis of these state-level policies, it's missing the household as the unit in which I think those gendered contradictions really emerge and then get parceled outwards to the city, to workspaces, and to other parts of Gurgaon. So when women say that, that this is a millennium city for them and that they are able to negotiate, they are able to walk public spaces, or they are able to, sort of perform gender in more confident ways, I might see where that's coming from in relation to the larger context of Haryana, simply because there is more public transport, or simply because there are more public facilities. But does that mean that violence against them has reduced? No, it doesn't. Because just during the lockdown, I remember newspapers being inundated with reports saying that cases of gender-based violence have increased or domestic violence have increased. Now, why is that happening? Where is that coming from? Second point, which women are we talking about? Are we talking about upwardly mobile women coming into the city from Delhi and working, or indeed upwardly mobile women from Gurgaon? Or are we talking about women from Haryana at large? Or are indeed we talking about migrant workers coming in from places as far as Bengal or Bihar into Gurgaon? So I think that part of Gurgaon's intrigue is the textures that it presents simply in the gender question. And at every level, I think, the experiences of women can be disaggregated because there is, as I said, a dominant sort of caste context, a dominant masculinities context, indeed now even a dominant religious context. So in our own household, our domestic help is from a village in Malda in Bengal, and she's a Muslim. And she lives in a village close by called Choma, which is a dominantly Yadav village and a dominantly Hindu village. And she talks to my mother incessantly about the kinds of microaggressions that they have to, face in terms of not being able to forget beef, in terms of not even being able to cook fish in their house, and who does the cooking, who cleans the utensils. I mean, these are questions that the gender question is always present in that sense. I don't think the idea of the Millennium City ever incorporated the queer body. I would be loath to imagine if it incorporated anybody but a sort of straight, dominant caste, male, prototype. So queers were definitely not in that imaginary. Women were also probably not in that imaginary. Has anything changed 2 decades after that Millennium City proclamation? I don't think so. I mean, as a queer person, I can tell you that, I've just never thought about Gurgaon as being part of my, broader sort of queer urban experience because, as I said, it doesn't allow you to perform gender in certain ways. I mean, you can, but with drastic consequences. So therefore, I don't think there's anything about the city that allows it to be queer friendly. But does that mean that there don't exist queer spaces? No, there are queer spaces. But like the nature of other queer spaces, they are fugitive. They exist on the cracks of cities. So there would be queer gatherings, for example, but they'd be in malls, which most people, indeed including queer people, might consider to be shady, if not raise questions about why they're being held here. So I think that, we aren't anywhere close to thinking or theorizing Gurgaon as a queer sort of space, precisely because of the contradictions of gender and masculinity, which I think are clouding this question in ways. And we need to kind of get beyond that. But is it a queer-friendly city? I would not say so. I don't feel safe as a queer person in Gurgaon necessarily. I think that what my mother is speaking to about my grandmother's anxiety over her, not returning home on time. I think it's lasted. I've seen it all through her working career in Gurgaon over the past 2 decades, and I think it has something to do also with the way in which public space is constructed in Gurgaon. Even though we have more bridges or even though we have more highways, but I'm sure this isn't just unique to Gurgaon, but public space is also a very sort of masculine space, a very hyper-masculine space. My mother, till a few years ago, used to drive by herself. And I remember this used to be a persistent anxiety in the entire household. Oh, she hasn't come back. Oh, call her up. Oh, oftentimes my father, would ask my mother to pick him up from work simply because he felt he needed to accompany her in the car, as she drove back by herself. And I should also repeat, another incident that I remember from childhood. I went to school in Delhi, but a lot of our teachers came, to school from Gurgaon. And we had a teacher, I remember I was in class 2, And she had gone, this happened in Gurgaon. She was staying in, South City, which is quite close to Huda City Centre metro station. She had gone to drop her daughter off at the South City Club, which at that time I think was one of the only, I'm talking early 2000s, so one of the only club kind of spaces in Gurgaon. And I remember she dropped her daughter off. As she was coming out of the club area, two men kind of waylaid her car and pointed to her tire and said something is up with it. And the moment she rolled her window down, they sort of attacked her, hit her with a pistol, with the butt of a pistol, and then shot at her. And the bullet kind of passed through her arm. It luckily didn't enter her body, but it passed through her arm. And I remember she drove. These were stories that we were told as children when she came back to school in a cast. And I remember for the longest period of time fearing that something similar would not happen to my mother, but the possibility of it happening. And it wasn't just my mother. In my case, my aunts, my mother's sisters. They used to work in various parts of Gurgaon.
Nikhil, can you tell me why you were worried about your mother being attacked with a gun when the very same thing could happen to your father or yourself?
I mean, a sort of simple answer to that would be that patriarchy. I mean, we are living in patriarchal structures, we are all bound by them, and I don't think being in Haryana is doing anything to alleviate that in any way. It's not presenting any kind of alternative. It's only reinforcing those gendered anxieties that family members, indeed the women of the family, also have vis-a-vis other women. But I think a sort of longer answer to that could also touch upon the fact that, in my family history, for instance, I mean, and this includes not just my own immediate family, but also my aunts and my broader family, there are just more women in the family. There are just more women who go out to work, whether it's my mother, her aunts, our other cousins, so numerically there are just more women. So I guess, they get thought about, in certain scripts as these working women. But I definitely think there's something to be thought of about, this contradiction between the fact that they are working women working in a corporate culture, and that corporate culture is affording them exposure to a kind of global, consumptive, world. But when it comes down to everyday concerns about their safety, suddenly they are sort of scripted back into this narrative of the unsafe woman. I mean, my thought now from a distance is, how different would their concerns towards my mother and her sisters be if they were not working in that corporate culture? I think the concerns would be very similar. So the point of saying that is that there is something about the way gender operates in this particular context, and indeed how it relationally operates in the context of masculinity, because the threat comes not from other women, but the so-called threat comes from, Gurgaon's rough masculine culture. So it's operating in relational terms, to one another. This idea of new gendered identities, there is perhaps something to it. There is a kind of new woman being produced, but I would think that new woman is being produced in extremely complex ways. I would even be hesitant to say there is a kind of a new woman, because who is that new woman? What background is she coming from? What caste, class, social affiliation does this new woman have? But even if one were to just think of one's experiences in Gurgaon, you drive through MG Road and you would see flyers and posters advertising these new maid services. Now, these are maids that you can get off the internet. These are presumably maids that will work in your house in a professional capacity. These are presumably maids who would work, or one imagines work, in a slightly different way to the way domestic workers would, might be mobilized. So there is definitely something about the way Gurgaon is encouraging women's labor to be produced in so-called modern ways. I'm pretty sure that the experience of that for women would open itself to new complexities, but the production of that identity of the modern woman who is a professional maid in someone's house, or the corporate woman who is working in the offices on MG Road or on Cyber City, or indeed the ways in which the mobility of the metro in Gurgaon has afforded women to come in from different parts of the city. So definitely there's a way in which new forms of gendered experience are being produced. But whether that's leading to the production of a new woman, I'm not very sure, because as I said, the issues that one talks about with respect to gender and women's experiences, violence, everyday kinds of violence, household, domestic violence, I'm not sure those have gone away anywhere. Indeed, I think that this narrative of the new woman runs the risk of obscuring some of those even further. That's as far as the women are concerned. As far as the new men are concerned, I would say something similar, that definitely Gurgaon was intended to create a new experience of masculinity, different to the ways in which Jat masculinity might have been imagined in a broader Haryana context, with its own baggage of weak sex ratio, khap panchayats, caste contradictions, struggles over land. So definitely Gurgaon was created to fashion a new consumptive man. But I'm not sure that they anticipated the kinds of men who would end up coming into Gurgaon as a result. Today, if you talk to a man on the street, I don't think that, I think that you could as much end up encountering somebody from Punjab in Gurgaon as you could end up encountering someone from Himachal or someone from Delhi. It's no longer just the sort of dominance of Jat men. And that fundamentally changes the ways in which caste, class, consumption, gender, masculinity is experienced at an everyday level. If I come to think of it, at that point in time in the early 2000s, the corporate culture, simply in terms of the number of corporate buildings that you had in Gurgaon, were few and far between. There was no cyber hub, certainly no cyber city. There were very few malls on MG Road. There were, all parts of New Gurgaon, starting from, Sikandarpur metro station all the way down into the Golf Course Road. There was hardly anything over there. But it was still this millennium city that was coming into being. But now, nearly 2 decades later, I think the city has, that sort of corporate Gurgaon has come into being in a very potent way. And I think that collision has also become starker, because there are more MNCs, there are more people coming in from Delhi, there are more people coming in from from urban centers. But equally, in one's interactions, there are also so many more people coming in from rural Haryana, so many more people coming in from rural Punjab, so many more people coming in from rural Himachal Pradesh. And Gurgaon becomes this kind of, this space in which everybody is trying to, get a share of something that they are chasing. And, resources are finite. Ecologically, Gurgaon's condition is pretty bad, pollution-wise, water resources-wise. There's very little availability of land. We have nearly encroached upon the Aravalis, in every possible way. So in every dimension, the economics of that collision between corporate Gurgaon and broader Haryana is really just the outward, part of it. But in other levels also, I think that collision is very stark for me. If one looks at this idea of Jat masculinity, it's obviously, like any other idea, very complex. But what are the sort of rudiments of the idea? Who are the Jats? The sort of landed, dominant castes in this part of Haryana, and the wealth that they have accumulated over a period of time is through the sale of that land or through a kind of incipient farming. They don't do the farming. They might give their land out to Gujars and others, but they are kind of dominant landed men. And so that masculinity is fashioned around this idea of land and wealth. But the sort of corporate masculinity that you're talking about would like to see itself as a more secularized, a more democratic masculinity, tied less, I think, to ideas of land, more to ideas of intellectual capital, more to ideas of global capital. But in my experience of Gurgaon, I think that it's difficult to parcel them away, because they're literally sort of sitting right next to each other. So even if I'm pretty sure, even if one were to examine land records of Cyber Hub and all, I'm pretty sure that there are Jat families and others who still might lay claim to the fact that this land actually belonged to them. And if you, I think an interesting flashpoint in this case is, the sort of Jat agitations for demanding inclusion into OBC quotas. Where does that come from? Why is there that demand in the first place? That demand is there because clearly there's a feeling among, Jats that their control over land or their control over resources and the wealth that they could get from those resources, is kind of reaching a kind of plateau. Or it's not able to, they're not able to essentially monetize the kinds of privileges, and dare I say the kinds of heteropatriarchal masculine privileges over land, over city spaces that they once had. And as a result, that's, I think, feeding into political struggles. That's feeding into social struggles. So I think Gurgaon is an incredibly complex laboratory, I think, for the ways in which gender and masculinity are playing out. And for me, as a resident of Gurgaon, the two things that have only added to the complexity of gender and masculinity is the communalization of everyday space in Gurgaon and changing caste relations with migration, with mobility, with more people coming in and disrupting the control of Jat men and Jat culture. It's also has consequences for women. It also has consequences for other men.